Hello, welcome to a new demo on DCNM 11.5 to NDFC 12 backup and restore. So for any existing customers to move from DCNM to the Nexus Dashboard Fabric Controller, this is for you. This is Karishma Gupta, Technical Marketing Engineer, Cisco. Now, before we delve into the different scenarios, I would like to cover the NDFC network connectivity. NDFC has two logical interfaces per node. We have the ND management interface and then we have the ND fabric or data interface. So those are the two different kind of interfaces to remember. Today, the requirement is the management and the fabric or data interfaces must be in different subnets. So that's the first rule of thumb. We must define a default route for ND services, which is by default a fabric interface default gateway. We must add a static route on ND for forcing connectivity out of the management interface. So that is how basic connectivity looks like. Now let's look at the different migration scenarios. Let's first start with DCNM standalone to NDFC. Now here we have a standalone DCNM node, and consider an example where we have your ETH0 and ETH1 in DCNM in different subnets and ETH2 is not used at all. The way to migrate it would be to really create a cluster of ND nodes. So it can vary, it can be a cluster of 3 nodes or 5 nodes depending on the virtual or physical form factor as well as the scale in your lab. So this is depicted only as an example. So here we have ETH0 and ETH1 in different subnets, which are the red and the blue subnets. You would migrate these into your management IP with the red subnet, which is our 172.28.8.0, and our fabric IP would be the same subnet as your ETH1 interface in DCNM, which is the 10.0.9.0 subnet. So this one's easy. We are starting with just two interfaces, ETH0 and ETH1, and ETH2 is not being used at all. Now in this case, we're using the same subnet for ETH0 and ETH1, and ETH2 is not used at all. In this particular case, what we're doing is we are using a different subnet for the management IP because our management and fabric IPs have to be in different subnets. So you're picking a 10.3.7.0/24 subnet, which needs to be externally reachable. And for the fabric IP, we are picking the very same red subnet, which is our 172.28.8.0. So this is when they are in the same subnet. Now what happens when ETH2 is being used as well? So we have ETH0 and ETH1 in different subnets, and ETH2 is being used for in-band. So on the left, you're seeing DCNM, which is a general scenario. A lot of people do this where we have all three in different subnets, the red, the blue, and the green. So there are two ways to do this. In the first topmost right picture, what we see here is basically a cluster of 3 ND nodes, and we have a management IP in the red subnet and the fabric IP in the green subnet. So that is how it would look like as an option 1. Or option 2 would be to use a management IP in the blue subnet and the fabric IP would be in the green subnet. So those are two different ways to achieve the migration. Now what happens when ETH0 and ETH1 are in the same red subnet and ETH2, which is in the green subnet, is being used for in-band? This one's easy. We are going to use our management IP in the red subnet and our fabric IP would be in the green subnet. So those are some of the standalone scenarios. Now let's look at DCNM native HA to NDFC. In this case, on the left, what we have is two DCNM nodes that we're using for HA, which is active backup, and you're going to migrate to an active cluster with ND. The very first scenario is ETH0 and ETH1 in different subnets, and ETH2 is being used as well. So you have the red, blue, and green. Likewise, on the right, we are going to either use the red and the green subnet, which you see on the top, or you can have a blue and green subnet as you see on the right. When we have the very same subnet for ETH0 and ETH1, which is the red subnet, you're going to use the same subnet for management IP, and for the fabric IP, we're using the subnet of ETH2. So those were some native HA examples. Now what happens when we have the DCNM native HA plus computes and we want to migrate this to NDFC? This is how it looks like. On the left we have 5 nodes, and in this particular example we are using different subnets. So we have ETH0 and ETH1 in different subnets, and we're using ETH2 as well. So our DCNM virtual IPs are listed here. What we're going to do is, again, we will have the management IP in the red subnet, or we can have the management IP in the blue subnet. The fabric IPs in both the examples relate to our E2 or the in-band IP subnet range, which is 10.3.7.0. So those are the two ways to achieve migration. When ETH0 and ETH1 are in the same subnet, we are going to basically use the very same subnet, which is 172.28.8.0 for the management IP. And for the fabric IP, we're going to use the 10.3.7.0 subnet, which is that of ETH2. So what are the high-level steps for DCNM 11.5 to NDFC 12.0 migration? So first scenario is our DCNM IPs are not reused for ND nodes. We're going to first deploy a cluster of VND or PND, that's virtual or physical, with a 3-node or 5-node cluster. In ND cluster configuration, we're going to go and add appropriate static routes for reachability, and we would add our external service IPs in the management and data pools. So this is the management IP and the fabric IP, the range. We would need these for NDFC. So that is what we do, and those are the scenarios we saw in the last few slides. Then we're going to install the NDFC app on ND cluster. We'll now take a backup from the DCNM that is running. We're going to copy that backup file out, and we're going to shut down that DCNM. We are then going to enable the NDFC app, and we do not enable any feature set. So we're not enabling our fabric controller, fabric discovery, SAN, LAN. We are simply going to do a backup and restore workflow in NDFC 12.0. We're going to select restore, and we'll provide the backup file that we have collected from DCNM 11.5. So these are the recommended steps. Now, if DCNM IPs are reused, the very first thing we're going to do is we'll take a backup from DCNM, and we're going to copy the file out and shut down the DCNM because we are reusing the same IPs. Now, again, we are going to deploy the cluster. We're going to add our static routes, add the service IPs in the management and the fabric or data pool. And thereon, we're going to enable the app. We will not enable any feature sets, but rather we are going to do a restore, and we'll provide the backup file from DCNM. So those are some steps when the DCNM IPs are reused or not used. So that was it for this demo. Hopefully it was useful. Thank you so much for watching.